The modern perception of the events that led up to the outbreak of the First World War is one of tragic misunderstandings between men who were ill-equipped to handle the issues that faced them. During the late 19th and early 20th century, the world was almost completely controlled by a small group of wealthy white men. They were educated aristocrats, businessmen, thinkers, etc. Their predecessors had perfectly engineered the world to benefit them. And so this new generation, born between 1870 and 1885, would grow up with the assurance that no matter what passion they followed, be it science, literature, art, music, law, business, etc., would have as close to a guarantee as possible of success. And so no matter how much they really did succeed in their field, they would spend the duration of their lives in comfort and security. This world of prosperity and endless potential is the world described by Stefan Zweig in his autobiographical book, The World of Yesterday, and by Bertrand in his autobiographical works. Using these two men as a guide, I would like to re-examine the years that led up to the outbreak of the First World War, and how this generation, which seemed the best equipped in history to face any sort of calamity, failed, and how we can learn from their failure to prevent our own seminal catastrophe. Before you can begin to understand the importance of the First World War and the generation that caused it, you must get a sense of the position that Europe was in during this time, and the general feeling of the period. The world of today is accustomed to tragedy and conflict. Thanks to the 24-hour news cycle, there is a constant stream of bad news and ill fortune ripe for consumption at any time. To be optimistic today is to be ill-informed or ignorant of the plight of so many people. But this was not the case in the late 19th century in Europe, as Zweig describes at the beginning of his book. Quote, "People no more believed in the possibility of barbaric relapses, such as wars between the nations of Europe, than they believed in ghosts and witches. Our fathers were doggedly convinced of the infallibly binding power of tolerance and conciliation. They honestly thought that divergences between nations and religious faiths would gradually flow into a sense of common humanity, and that peace and security, the greatest of goods, would come to all mankind." End quote. Now, it's worth mentioning that this sentiment is wildly Eurocentric, and that the unbelievable barbaric relapses that he describes were happening on a daily basis in the European colonies all over the world. But even so, imagine growing up with this mindset, that the whole world, or the parts of the world that mattered anyway, were peaceful and full of sensible people like yourself, and that your lifetime would be one of infinite opportunity and complete security. The first couple chapters of Zweig's book go into detail on his education in Vienna. His was a generation raised on art and literature. He describes the countless afternoons spent with peers debating and critiquing the great works of the day, and losing himself in the theater. Bertrand also describes his childhood as the son of a former British Prime Minister in a 1952 television interview. Quote, "The world where I was young was a solid world, a world where all kinds of things that have now disappeared were thought to be going to last forever. It was thought that there would be ordered progress throughout the world." End quote. Both Zweig and Russell cite 1914 as the end of this era of ordered progress and security. The fatal flaw of this world was not necessarily the people who controlled it. As both Zweig and Russell recount, there were many sensible, rational people back then, just as there are today. At the turn of the century, as I described earlier, control of everything was firmly in the hands of educated men like Russell and Zweig. But as a percentage of the total world population, the group that these two men fell into was absolutely minuscule. Compared to the average person back then, they had much more influence as individuals than most people, period, do today. And yet, even with this outsized control, they were still unable to mobilize that influence in time to prevent catastrophe. On this subject, Russell writes, quote, "During the hot days at the end of July, I was at Cambridge discussing the situation with all and sundry. I felt strongly that England ought to remain neutral, and I collected the signatures of a large number of professors and fellows to a statement which appeared in the Manchester Guardian to that effect. I knew it was my business to protest, however futile protest might be." End quote. Zweig goes into even more detail on these anti-war efforts. Quote, "Slowly, but too slowly, too hesitantly, as we now know, the forces rejecting war came together. There was the Socialist Party, millions of people on all sides, with a program opposing war. There were powerful Catholic groups under the leadership of the Pope, and several international groups of companies. There were a few reasonable politicians who spoke out against any undercover dealings. We writers also ranged ourselves against war, although as usual we spoke in isolation, expressing ourselves as individuals rather than closing ranks to speak firmly as an organization." End quote. He later goes on to write, quote, "The forces working for hatred, in line with their baser nature, were more violent and aggressive than the forces of reconciliation, and there were material interests behind them which, of their very nature, were more unscrupulous than ours." End quote. If either of these men had possessed even the faintest idea of the cataclysmic global effects that the coming war would launch, I can't imagine what they would have done. It is sort of terrifying to think just how new a phenomenon the modern world is. The political, religious, and social ideas upon which the world is currently based are so laughably inadequate for the issues that we have faced over the past century, let alone the issues that we're currently facing. In hearing this story, you are probably horrified, as was I, of all the parallels that can be made between the world of 1914 and 2022. However, I think it's important to note some key differences. For one thing, despite the unacceptable modern levels of wealth inequality, the world today is controlled by a vastly greater number of people than it was back then. More people can vote and participate in the operation of society than ever before. This has increased the rate of innovation and also, I think, decreased the fragility of our civilization structure. Our generation is also greatly advantaged in that we have unprecedented access to information and historical records. We have the capability, if we choose to use it, to inform ourselves on both the failure of the past and the issues of today. The only way to defeat the superior forces of hatred and misunderstanding, then, are to utilize the tools that all of you watching this are privileged to have, and to the best of your ability, mobilize them to create a better future.